The message came in just as I reached the curve by the old elm tree, where the road dips slightly, and the breeze from the river catches the edge of your collar. I paused, pulled my phone from my jacket pocket, and tapped open the screen. "Don't come to the party. My wife said you'll ruin it. Evan." Below it, little hearts blinked up at me. 16 of them. Cousins, nephews, in-laws, even my sister's daughter, who once cried on my porch after her miscarriage, had liked it. Not one comment beneath, not a single voice saying, "That's not right." Just silence. Then the algorithm showed a line. Evan changed the group name to family, no drama. I typed 2 words. Understood. The gravel crunched slightly under my heel as I stood still. The wind carried a sharpness that hadn't been there earlier. I slipped the phone back into my coat and kept looking at the empty road ahead, as if some version of me might still be walking there, one who didn't know what had just happened. I turned back before finishing my loop. My hands stayed at my sides, too heavy to lift. The door to the house clicked shut behind me, and I moved without sound through the kitchen. I didn't turn on any lights. I didn't make tea at the counter. I gripped the edge with both hands. My palms were warm, but my chest felt hollow, not angry, not even shocked. Just displaced. They weren't planning a party. They were drawing a line, and I had been asked not to cross it. The kettle hissed on the stove as I stood motionless beside it, watching steam rise like breath from something dying. I poured the water into my mug. Black coffee only, no sugar. The kind that clings to your tongue and reminds you you're awake. I didn't sip it right away, just held it. The ceramic warming my palms? This wasn't the first time. I paid for their wedding everything from the dress alterations to the floral arrangements flown in from California. Kendra didn't say thank you. Not once. Not in a card. Not in a call. At the rehearsal dinner, I was seated next to a cousin I hadn't seen since 1994. Kendra's mother, meanwhile, was at the head table beside the groom. Last Christmas, they asked if they could check on the house in Cannon Beach. A week later, I saw photos on social media, family dinners, ocean walks, champagne flutes lifted in front of my fireplace. When I asked, Evan shrugged. "Oh, we didn't want to bother you. We figured you wouldn't come anyway." I had said nothing then, just smiled, as if it hadn't landed, as if I hadn't watched that house being built from the foundation up, alone, after Richard died. But this was different. This was a performance, one meant to humiliate me in front of everyone, and everyone had played their part. The silence in the house used to feel like a sanctuary. Now it pressed against me like something waiting to be broken. I walked to my office and sat down at the desk. The drawer was locked, as always. I kept the key in a taped envelope behind a family photo. I peeled it off without hesitating. Inside were the folders I'd built over decades: wills, trusts, land deeds, business shares, and the signatures they'd long forgotten they signed. I pulled out the file marked Contingency Inheritance Drafts. I can still hear her voice from last spring, drifting over the clatter of serving tongs and the smell of marinated chicken. I had been standing near the patio steps, refilling a bowl of fruit, when Kendra leaned toward one of her friends and said it soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant for me, loud enough to make sure I heard. She asks the same stories. "Where's those blazers?" It's like, sad. The friend laughed. Evan didn't correct her. I set the bowl down, careful not to spill anything. My hands were steady. They always are when the sting is fresh. On the drive home, I rolled down the window just enough to let the spring air cool my face. I told myself it was nothing, that daughters-in-law slip, that I was being sensitive. When I got home, I baked muffins for the neighbors' kids because routine steadies me, and the kitchen gives me something to hold on to. The next morning, I sent a payment toward Evan's car loan. A surprise gift. I wrote in the memo, though the generosity felt oddly hollow even then. I remembered every word. Standing in my office now, I held the folder I'd labeled years ago, when Richard was still alive and we'd agreed to stay ahead of every possibility. Contingency, valuation phase. I set it on the desk. The weight of it, familiar. Inside were financial summaries, projected allocations, and notes I'd written in my own hand names, amounts, conditions, not threats, just structure. My way of ensuring the family stayed intact long after I no longer could guide it. But families shift, expectations decay, and sometimes the only way to keep something from collapsing is to measure exactly where it's cracking. I picked up the phone and scrolled down to a number I hadn't dialed in a year. When my estate attorney answered, I didn't bother with small talk. "We need a meeting," I said. Soon, by the time I reached the bottom of the folder, a strange calm had settled over me, clearer than anger, sharper than hurt. I slid the documents across my desk one by one, reacquainting myself with signatures, clauses, and decisions made years ago when my children were too young to understand the weight of paperwork. Evan's first house, my name sat beside his in ink that hadn't faded at all. I'd told him it was temporary, that we'd transfer full ownership once his business stabilized. He never asked again, and I never insisted. The business loan he'd bragged about securing on his own, my credit was the backbone of it. Without my cosign, the bank wouldn't have touched the application, and the family LLC, created back when Richard and I were planning for generational wealth, my 51% voting share remained untouched simply because no one bothered to review the binder it lived in. Retired and sentimental. That's what Kendra liked to call me. A woman with soft sweaters and softer opinions. If only she had read a contract as carefully as she painted her nails. I logged into my accounts, downloaded the quarterly statements, and printed them. The stack grew quickly: ownership summaries, portfolio maps, property tax receipts. My hands moved with practiced precision. I'd built my company with the same rhythm, deliberate and relentless. Next came the transfers, updating custodial rights, reassigning beneficiaries, reclassifying assets into protected categories. Each step was a stitch pulling tight a seam I had let loosen for far too long. When I finished, I opened the drawer where I kept small things that once meant something. There lay the bracelet Evan gave me on Mother's Day 2 years ago. Silver, simple, chosen, because Kendra said it looked appropriate for her age. I slipped it off my wrist and set it aside. It felt too light to belong to the moment. Then I picked up the phone again and dialed the forensic accountant, my voice steady as I introduced myself and requested a full audit. There were still calculations to be made, and I intended to make every one of them. They walked in like it was nothing. Monday morning, 9:02 a.m. on the dot. I'd already been at the office for an hour, reviewing the final draft of the asset restructuring plan. When I heard the elevator, I didn't flinch. Evan entered first, his usual eager grin in place. Kendra followed, holding his hand like they were still in the honeymoon phase. Though she was dressed like someone headed into a negotiation, she expected to win. "Hey, Mom, we had a big idea," Evan said, as if last week's message had never happened. Kendra held out a folder labeled Boutique Pitch in looping, floral script. "We think it's a perfect time to expand the family brand." I nodded once. "We'll use the conference room." They followed me down the hall. The overhead lights buzzed softly, and the air held that faint mix of paper, ink, and lemon wood polish that always calmed me. My assistant had already placed the coffee tray on the table. 2 cups, cream and sugar off to the side. I didn't pour any. I placed the envelope on the table in front of them, thick, marked with my attorney's seal. No smile, no warmth. Kendra's fingers hesitated before opening it. She scanned the top page, then the next. By the third, Her hand stiffened. The pitch folder slipped slightly in her lap. Evan leaned over her shoulder. "What's this?" he asked. "This is old stuff," Kendra said too quickly. "It doesn't even apply." I didn't answer. Inside the envelope, financial ledgers, legal declarations, and a certified history of claims filed under Kendra's name, including one very specific lawsuit in another state that hadn't been disclosed to Evan. All of it carefully documented, reviewed, and timed for presentation. Evan looked between the two of us. His smile had faded, and a subtle edge of panic crept into his voice. "What's going on?" I remained seated, my hands folded. The scream came at page 12. Until then, Kendra had tried to hold her face together. Her fingers stayed curled around the edge of the conference table. The pitch folder abandoned on the floor beside her chair, but by the time she reached the third section, background legal and personal conflicts, the color had drained from her. Inside the file were printouts of settlement records, some sealed but referenced through public liens. A statement from a woman named Dana, who had been married to Kendra's former husband. Dana had alleged coercion, fraud, and false accusations that led to a nearly year-long custody battle. The restraining order, dismissed. The stalking claim, withdrawn with a check attached. A pattern, loud claims, legal threats, silent payouts. There was even a subpoena from a fraud case Kendra had narrowly avoided. Her name had been redacted in the press, but I knew where to look. Kendra slapped the papers down with a trembling hand. "This is illegal," she hissed. I didn't lift my gaze. It's public record. Evan sat frozen beside her, his jaw slack, his eyes darting across the papers like he might find a loophole in the mess unfolding beside him. He wasn't defending her. Not this time. He looked at me, not with anger, but with something more hollow, like he'd just realized how little he truly knew about the woman he'd married. Kendra stood abruptly. The chair scraped loudly against the hardwood, and then she screamed, sharp, raw, unfiltered, not from guilt, not from remorse, but from the one thing she'd never prepared for being exposed. My secretary, seated just beyond the glass, rose calmly and walked over. With a soft click, she closed the conference room door. The sound muffled, but it didn't matter. The scream had already done its damage. Kendra spun toward Evan, demanding something I couldn't hear. He didn't answer. His hands were flat on the table, steady, eyes still fixed on the file. I reached into my briefcase and withdrew a second envelope. This one had Evan's name on it. The door had barely closed behind Kendra when the room settled into stillness. Evan didn't speak right away. He just sat there, staring down at the documents like they were pieces of something broken he didn't know how to fix. He lifted one page at a time, slower than before. His eyes moved left to right, lips parted but silent. When he finally looked up, his voice was thin. "I didn't know." "I did," I said. He flinched at the calm in my tone. I think he expected me to lash out, to cry, to fall apart in a way that would prove I still needed him. I didn't. I waited. I continued. "To see if you'd defend me. When they made the jokes, when they forgot to invite me, when she said I'd ruin your party." I paused. "You didn't." He buried his face in his hands. I let the silence linger. I didn't reach across the table. I didn't touch his arm. That part of us, the reaching part, had eroded slowly, and now it was gone. "I'm sorry," he whispered into his palms. "I don't need sorry," I said, rising to my feet. "I need honesty and distance." From the folder beside me, I pulled one final document and exit clause from the family trust. Clean, uncontested. He could walk away, take what he had already received, leave the rest. I set it in front of him, next to his untouched coffee. "It's unsigned," I said. He didn't ask why. He didn't ask for time. He just looked at the paper as if it held the weight of 1,000 conversations we never had. I gathered the rest of the folders, slid them into my bag, and closed the clasp. He didn't move. His hands stayed flat on the table, fingers curled inward, not in anger, just in resignation. As I reached the door, I turned back once, not with regret, but with finality. "There's more coming," I said, "not just for you." Then I left him sitting there, alone with his coffee and his silence. I didn't call my older sons. I didn't need to. By Thursday, they'd opened their certified envelopes sent out Monday afternoon. Same day, Evan and Kendra walked into my office with their boutique pitch and left with silence. Each packet contained 3 things: a letter in plain language, a notarized copy of my most recent will, and an updated clause labeled discretionary dissolution. No flourish, no threats, just facts. If they chose to align themselves with humiliation, silence, or convenience, then they were also choosing to stand outside the estate. My lawyer forwarded the calls. One came in angry, demanding a meeting. The other came in quietly, voice catching halfway through. Neither surprised me. I didn't return either call. Instead, I walked to the garden store on Maple, the same one I'd gone to for 20 years. Tucked behind the post office, run by a retired couple who never asked too many questions, I browsed the spring seed display even though it was too late in the season to plant most of it. Habit more than anything. At the checkout, I added a new pair of gloves to the basket. My old ones were worn thin, stretched at the fingers. Soil-stained beyond saving. I'd kept them anyway, for years longer than made sense. I thought about legacies on the way home. How we spend our lives building something we think will outlast us: names on deeds, holiday traditions, recipes, investments, stories told around tables, and how easily those things become distorted when passed into ungrateful hands. Maybe what we leave behind shouldn't be a fortune or a structure to uphold loyalty. Maybe the legacy is this peace, hard-earned, quiet, intact. I set the gloves on the kitchen counter, beside a stack of unwashed dishes. I didn't wash them. I didn't fold laundry. I didn't check the mailbox again. I poured myself water and sat by the window as the light shifted across the room. By the end of the month, the first rumors began drifting back to me. Half whispers from former colleagues, clipped messages from acquaintances who suddenly remembered my number. Kendra had filed a statement claiming harassment, painting herself as a targeted wife and me as a vengeful mother unwilling to let go. It might have worked if she hadn't overplayed her hand. The investigators' reports held, the documentation held, and when the clerk reviewing her claim asked for supporting evidence, she had none to give. Dana went public 2 days later. Not with drama, not with theatrics, just a steady, recorded statement describing what she endured during her marriage. 2 other women followed her lead, each one telling pieces of a pattern that had gone ignored too long. Their stories didn't mention me, but they didn't need to. The boutique, her grand project, her future, the thing she thought she could hook Evan into funding never even made it past the paperwork stage. The LLC dissolved before it was formally registered. Her name vanished from the state database as if it had never belonged there to begin with. She left Evan quietly. No final argument, no apology, just a short message asking him not to contact her again. I heard it from him indirectly, filtered through the kind of grief that comes from realizing you've been used, not loved. I kept my distance. Instead, I updated my trust. The funds that once flowed toward family branches now shifted toward a foundation supporting elder rights legal assistance, housing security, financial literacy, real needs, real people. No strings that could be twisted into entitlement. I never spoke ill of Kendra. Not once. I didn't need to. The paper trail she left behind had already spoken with more precision than I ever could. One evening, as I sorted through the revised documents at my dining table, The last of the sun slipped across the hardwood floor, touching the edges of the folders like a quiet reminder that seasons turn regardless of who chooses to stay. I closed the final binder and reached for my coat. I still needed to prepare the garden for tomorrow. I take my tea out to the back patio each morning now. The cup fits just right in my hand, older than any of my children. It still does its job. Not everything needs replacing. The garden's smaller than it used to be. I pulled up the ornamental beds last fall and replaced them with things that root quickly and give back mint. Tomatoes, a row of stubborn sunflowers that refuse to lean no matter how hard the wind tries. I water them myself. No help, no reminders, no one offering to do it later, and they grow anyway. There's a letter on the table beside me. Cream-colored envelope. Familiar handwriting. My eldest. He waited longer than the others. Maybe because guilt takes longer to bloom in people who think they did nothing wrong. I haven't opened it. Not because I won't, just because I'm not in a hurry. There's no group chat anymore. No birthday plans made without me. No photos I wasn't invited to take. Just silence. But it's not empty. It has space. Room to breathe. I play soft music from a speaker by the door. Instrumental. Mostly. Piano. Some mornings. I hum along without realizing. The mint carries in the breeze when I brush past it, and sometimes I'll tear a leaf to rub between my fingers. It lingers in the skin. The phone buzzes once. Then again, I let it ring. Whatever it is, it can wait. I finish the last of my tea and set the cup down on the table, beside the unopened letter. Then I ease into the shade and run my hand across the fold of the chair cushion, smoothing it out. There's a planting tray by the steps, basil this time. Something new, something fragrant and simple. I'll start it this afternoon, once the sun softens. Tomorrow, I'll harvest the tomatoes. They've ripened faster than I expected.